welcome to Variant Mind Podcast, brought to you by the Institute of European Rights. I'm your host, Teodoras Žukas, and I'll be guiding today's conversation. It is my pleasure to introduce our today's guest, Christian Leuprecht, professor at the Royal Military College, as well as Queen's University in Canada, a senior fellow at the MacDonald Law Institute, and the visiting fellow at the Wilfred Martin Center for European Studies, on which behalf Mr. Leuprecht is visiting Vilnius, Lithuania today. Thank you for being with us.
It's such a pleasure to return to Vilnius. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. We are recording this podcast on March 21st, 2025. It is worth mentioning these days the date exactly when we are talking, and the location is Vilnius, Lithuania. And Christian, I will go straight to the point, and I will like to start on the state of transatlantic relations today. As a scholar of strategy, with focus on transatlantic relations during and beyond the Cold War, how would you assess the current state of NATO and transatlantic relations? Given the shifting political rhetoric in Washington, would you say that we are facing an absolutely unique crisis in the history of transatlantic relations?
Look, NATO has proven itself an amazingly resilient institution, and the death of NATO had been announced multiple times in the past. I often like to point out that the first crisis on burden sharing dates back to 1951, John Foster Dulles, just a couple of years after the founding of NATO. So this is not to say that the crises and the challenges are not to be taken lightly. But NATO is a very unique organization. There's nothing comparable anywhere else in the world where 32 countries have decided they're going to get together and try to find 30 countries with very different geographies, very different political cultures, very different geostrategic orientations, and have decided they're going to work together on issues of common national interest, in particular security interest, and in particular as it pertains to collective defense and regional and international stability. And so you could do away with the organization, but the challenge is for all members, first and foremost for the United States. The transaction costs to get things done on foreign and international affairs in general, and in particular on defense and security, would go up fairly dramatically. It doesn't mean that it might not be more efficient and more effective for the United States to deal with countries bilaterally, especially when there's a considerable power asymmetry, for instance, between Lithuania and the United States, where the US president can just wield US economic, political power in order to try to get smaller countries to do things the way the Americans would like to do. But there's a substantial efficiency to be gained in coordinating all these countries. Now, that doesn't mean that the US doesn't have real concerns about NATO. It's, as I sort of like to point out, I think people always forget that the US didn't set up NATO to make the world a better place. The US set up NATO with US interests in mind and to assert US interests. And so no surprise that the US has been one of the three primary veto players within NATO over the years. And so inherently, the US is going to leverage NATO to assert, optimize, and maximize its interests. And when it feels that NATO is not delivering on US interests, that's ultimately when the organization starts to get in trouble. But we knew from day one that keeping the Americans on board was always going to be a difficult challenge. And if we think back to the first NATO Secretary General, the Brit, Lord Ismay, his famous quote about what's the purpose of NATO? Keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Knowing full well from day one, everybody would have to work hard to make sure that this organization remains in the interests of the United States while performing in the interests of member countries.
So if I understand you correctly, you are saying that the today crisis, if we can call it a crisis. I believe we can, at least political crisis, is not the matter of just this period of time of Trump and of his rhetoric on this particular White House, that you are referring that there are some structural, problems, if I may say, within NATO that are now echoing itself within the transatlantic community, if I may say.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of challenges. So one is that if you look at NATO, the Cold War was easy, right? We had the enemy. Everybody sort of postured themselves to take on the enemy, deter, contain that enemy, and everything was good. When you got to the end of the Cold War, look at the myriad of tasks that armed forces have today and that NATO has taken on, from professional development tasks to the stability operations, to the collective sort of security, if you want, operations. Look at the new strategic concept and the expansion of tasks. And of course, at the same time, we've had, especially among European countries, the supposed peace dividend, where countries pared back their defense spending, their defense capabilities, very substantially. And so we've had, on the one hand, a quantitative and qualitative proliferation of tasks, many of which are quite complex. And you can see this just in the number of generals that we have that perform tasks that didn't exist 30 years ago. Think about missile defense, for instance, but we can come up with 36 tasks that militaries do today, but that were never really adequately resourced. And that sort of worked as long as there wasn't really an existential threat. Because if you look over the last 25 years, really, most of the missions that NATO sort of performed were sort of, in a way, discretionary, right? We tried to get some political consensus, and we tried to figure out what everybody wanted to do and what everybody didn't want to do. And, then we contributed a bit here, we contributed a bit there. But now, of course, we're back to genuinely existential threats and genuinely existential questions, in addition to the host of other things that militaries and NATO member countries have been asked to do. We also need to remember that the United States does bear some responsibility. The example that I like to cite is, there's often a complaint that, where's Germany's heavy armor? Where did all the tanks go? Well, in the 1990s, it was the United States that tried to get member countries, in particular Germany, to abandon all the heavy tank corps and go light infantry. Right? And so now the security environment has changed, and so now we want everybody to pivot back. So I always like to say, it's also in member countries' interests not always to follow the direction of the United States, but to make sure they also think of their own national interests, because the smart countries in Europe always knew where the ultimate threat was going to be. The smart countries always knew that the Russians could never be trusted. And so there was perhaps also some naivete, and I think the naivete increases the further away you get from Moscow in terms of correlation. And at the same time, the United States was looking for partners and allies to help assert its sort of broader global interests and global security and the like. So, there's probably a balance to be found here. And now we have to come back and re-find the heart and the core and the crux of the mission. The challenge is, of course, I think the gauntlet that the U.S. has thrown down is U.S. interests since the end of the Cold War have clearly pivoted. They've pivoted to the Indo-Pacific. We've known that for over a decade with the infamous pivot by the Obama administration. So, everybody wants to blame Trump for the crisis here and so forth. Clearly doesn't understand their history in terms of the messaging from Washington. So we've had a declining attention, interests, and commitments from the United States to NATO for a decade and a half at least. And Europeans, I think, had a hard time reading the tea leaves in terms of what that meant in terms of arming up, and what that meant in terms of also becoming more autonomous in asserting their own interests. Because my sense is, if we look at the current discourse, what's happening in Ukraine and how we influence Russian decision-making is far more geostrategically important to Europeans than it is to Washington. And so Washington is saying, look, we're going to cut a deal that the Trump administration believes, rightly or wrongly, to be in America's best interest. And what it turns out is that the European Union, Europe, does not have enough capability to be able to influence materially that decision-making. So I get back to the point that NATO, first and foremost, is not a military alliance. It is a political alliance. And it is an opportunity for countries to shape the environment, right? Any military officer will tell you want to shape the environment rather than fight against it. And what Europe is currently doing, because we don't have the capabilities to assert ourselves, means that we are now reliant to living with an environment that we don't have the ability to shape and that we might have to fight against. So the lesson to draw from this is think a couple of steps ahead, think of the armed forces as an instrument of foreign policy. And if we have robust armed forces, it gives us the ability to assert ourselves and our interests in a way that currently we cannot. And we can clearly see that we're the net loser when it comes to relations with Moscow, when we don't have a robust capacity to assert ourselves.
I would want to stay a little bit on the history of Cold War and the status of transatlantic relations in the Cold War. You already mentioned the famous 1951 John Foster Dulles comment on the burden sharing. We had plenty of cases, I think you would agree with me, on where the so-called interests or the worldview between the United States and Europe differed significantly. We can talk about the early Kennedy administration and its tensions vis-a-vis Adenauer chancellorship. We can talk about Vietnam War and the Johnson administration, and then especially their very harsh policy regarding United Kingdom and during the Sterling crisis. Then we had Ostpolitik, which of course I think was part of the Kissingerian relaxation of tensions paradigm, but there were definitely issues. And then my favorite one is 2003 and the Iraqi war they say a second Iraq war, but the Operation Cobra, and how different those perceptions were between the so-called old Europeans, Berlin and Paris, and on the one hand, and Washington on the other hand. My question is that whether you would see all these cases and many others that you are aware of the transatlantic tensions as some kind of the ad hoc situations of difference, or as the general, completely fundamental different approach towards the international system between Europe and America.
So there's two key threads that run through this. One is U.S. unilateralism, right? So people forget, why does the U.S. pay for this very large military? So the U.S. allies and partners are nice to have, but when in doubt, the U.S. always wants to have the ability to go it alone. And that's the signal by the Trump administration to Europe. You folks are nice to have, but America doesn't need you to assert itself and its interests. So you need to think about whether you want to come on board or not. He's basically giving Europeans a choice. And, the way I like to express this is, with Democrats, it's unilateralism with a smile. With Republicans, it's unilateralism with a frown. But it's always about U.S. unilateralism. And people miss that part, right? So people make sort of these claims about the U.S. is isolationist. Well, no, the U.S. hasn't been isolationist since the late 19th century. And in the world that we live in, the U.S. is definitely not going back to being isolationist. But the U.S. is becoming far more unilateralist. because it feels that the current arrangements, military, economic, and political, increasingly do not serve US interests. And so the US is simply deciding to opt out of arrangements that it feels are either not serving its interest or that are too complicated and too costly. So why is this unilateralism comment so important? Because I think there's a perception in Europe that the US is sort of this benign hegemon, right? It's the empire by invitation. Everybody wanted to join NATO, but then it turns out that the Americans saying, okay, so we built this relationship quite deliberately after World War II. We made sure that Europe could regain its prosperity, and that prosperity was only going to come if we also provided security. So the US deliberately underwrote a security umbrella for allies and partners in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific. Why did it do that? Because of a rim strategy to make sure that its adversaries would not be able to control the coasts that would be nearest in terms of approaches to the United States. So it wasn't just about keeping the Soviets out of Europe and being able to have some influence and control over Europe. There's a quite deliberate, systematic rim strategy that defined the Atlantic and the Pacific approaches, and the Vietnam War and the like sort of falls in sort of those broader approaches. Europe interpreted that, I think, largely as the US being multilateralist. We're going to work with other countries, and we're going to work together, and we're all going to be nice to each other, which is, I don't think, what the US had ever intended. Now, of course, from a soft power perspective, there's people like Joseph Nye and so forth who argue that it's much easier and less costly simply to make yourself attractive, right? In trade relations, NATO was a way for the US to make itself very attractive to a whole host of countries, rather than sort of hard power and the cost that ultimately come with hard power. But I think from a US perspective, the sense that, look, we underwrote the prosperity of Europe. We underwrote the security of Europe. And yet the Cold War has been over for 30 years. Why is it that we're still underwriting and subsidizing trade relations with our closest allies? Why are we still subsidizing their defense and their security when they're perfectly prosperous and technologically advanced to go and look after themselves and look after their own neighborhood? And to boot, and so this is where your Afghanistan exam from 2003 is so important. I mean, Kaplan's book, The Paradise and Power, I think Europeans underestimate to what extent 9/11 and then 2003 Iraq, Afghanistan was a watershed moment strategically in the United States and for the American public. That when the US asked for support from European countries, the support was rather muted. And what's interesting is, of course, it lined up exactly along the lines of old and new NATO. The old member countries were all, well, maybe, and we could possibly go to Afghanistan, but, we don't really want to go to Iraq. The new NATO member countries, they all lined up behind the Americans because they knew exactly where their bread was buttered, because their orientation, of course, was always towards Moscow and always knowing where the ultimate threat was. And the intuition that if you want, I like to turn around sort of this phrase by John F. Kennedy, right? It's like the ask not what America can do for you, but what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. I think, the new NATO member countries always knew what I think Europe is discovering now. Ask not what America can do for you, but what you can do for America. That is the gauntlet that I think the Trump administration has thrown down in terms of, we've been doing this for all these decades. Where are you when we need you? And where's your commitment? If we're not asking you to bring large flotillas of navies to the Indo-Pacific, we're simply asking you to look after your own responsibilities in your own neighborhood when it comes to Russia, when it comes to the Mediterranean, when it comes to failed states and terrorism and migration along the Mediterranean rim, and when it comes to providing effective deterrence for your neighborhood. And I think there's a bit of I don't want to defend or apologize for the Trump administration, but I think there's a bit of sense of frustration generally in Washington that the Europeans are sort of blaming the United States for not doing enough on Ukraine and on Russia, when people in Washington are saying, well, hang on. Why aren't you looking after your neighborhood? Why are we doing this on your behalf?
Although half of a support, the financial support that is being given to Ukraine is covered by Europe, and there are often the cases where current administration officials misinterpret the amounts and the numbers. But I get your point. That's we this is not for us to go to the details about this. Yes, please.
So you're right. I am caricaturizing the U.S. position, and that there is a very valid European response to the support that Europe has provided. I think European partners have not been very good at articulating that. But you're also dealing with a Trump administration that is not very big on facts and data and is very big on stories. And I think there's a Trump narrative that has a lot of traction with Trump supporters. He understands who his audience is domestically. And we've not been very good at telling our story because we've largely let technocrats own this, in part because I think many European politicians have been rather reticent to explain to their populations why this is necessary, why we're providing all this defense equipment, why we're effectively underwriting a war in Ukraine, because it's politically not particularly popular in Europe to do that. And so now we're harvesting to some extent what we ourselves sowed, and it is ultimately up to politicians to have the guts to explain to their populations what it is we're doing and why we're doing it. And without defending any one particular country or leader, look at the way Keir Starmer has been articulating in the United Kingdom to his population what the United Kingdom is doing and the amounts of money it is spending are absolutely vital and existential for the United Kingdom and its geostrategic interests. There's a lot to be learned.
But fundamentally, the last question on this point. You don't believe that there is a chance to get back to some sort of status quo ante in European security architecture, meaning intensive American military engagement in European security after all what we're seeing, witnessing today?
So there's several reasons why not. And I think anybody who believes that we might get back there is playing a very dangerous wager that they're going to lose, and that's going to come at the expense of not just European sovereignty, but likely war in Europe. So first reason is, just historically, look at sort of how the center of gravity in the world has shifted, right? In the ancient world, the center of gravity was around the Mediterranean. With the discovery, in quotation marks, of the Americas, the center of gravity shifted to the Atlantic, and now the center of gravity has shifted to the Indo-Pacific. So clearly, if you're a superpower, where are you going to allocate the bulk of your resources if the main challenge to you as a superpower is coming from the Indo-Pacific, and you know that that's where a large part of the center of gravity for the future of the world is? No surprise, it's also home to half the world's population and so forth. So the Americans are saying, like, why are we allocating all these resources to what, from a U.S. geopolitical, geostrategic perspectives in terms of a superpower, are really sideshows? The Middle East, Russia, and the like. That's not to say that it doesn't matter for U.S. Strategy into U.S. interests. But so that's number one, that the geopolitical center of gravity is shifting. The second is that the U.S. is very preoccupied at home. The last 25 years or so have not been very kind to a large part of the U.S. population. And these are people who are frustrated. They're the same people who are frustrated in Europe. They're the people who tend to have lower levels of education or no education. They're the people whose jobs are at greatest risk, or they're the people who are unemployed, and who feel really left out of politics and the benefits of globalization and trade and so forth of the last 25 years.
The losers of globalization, as Engelhardt, I think, called this part of societies in the West.
And of course, those are the people who have Trump's ear. And so, and this is going to, the polarization, deep divisions in US society are consuming a growing amount of bandwidth in Congress and by the president. So there's simply, in Washington, there's always only so much bandwidth to begin with. And I think the general bandwidth for foreign and international affairs is narrowing simply because the domestic bandwidth is taking up so much more room. And so the little bit of time the Americans can devote to sort of international attention is going to be preoccupied with the issues that are their top priorities. And the Trump administration has made it clear, job one is China. And everything else is secondary. And so if you only have very limited attention spans, then you decide we're going to put all of our energy here, and the rest is sort of necessarily going to get short shrift. And the third is we forget that the Americans too have scarce resources. There's only so much to go around. Look at, for instance, U.S. shipbuilding, right? Shipbuilding capacity is going flat out, and the Americans still can't come close to where they need to be in order to be competitive with China. And so the Americans are saying, why are we diverting our scarce resources to these secondary theaters in Europe, to the Middle East and so forth, when we really need them to be in the Indo-Pacific? Now, here's a counterfactual. If the U.S. hadn't gone into Iraq and into Afghanistan, right? So you remember, Trump was already quite critical of these never-ending wars in his first administration. You remember he cut the deal on Afghanistan in terms of the drawdown that, as we all know, didn't end particularly well. But the counterfactual is, imagine if the U.S. had not gone into Iraq and Afghanistan and had spent that $4 trillion of U.S. resources on containing China. How different the world would be today. Would we have a Putin that would have felt emboldened in Moscow if we had managed to keep China sort of more in its boundaries? And I think this is a major part of the thinking, that what would the world look like if we had done things differently? And at least from a Trump administration perspective, let's not repeat the mistakes from the past. And that's going to come at some agony for some allies and for some partners, and that's just a way of life. And so I think the signal is America isn't abandoning its allies, right? The new NATO ambassador, Matt Whitaker, has made it very clear that the U.S. is not abandoning its allies. The U.S. is not abandoning its commitment to Article 5. But what the U.S. is doing, it is shifting resources to other parts of the world where it feels it can get better bang for its buck in terms of U.S. interests and U.S. priorities. And that necessarily is going to leave a void in Europe, that simply to stay at the level that Europe is at, Europe is going to have to do a lot more and spend a lot more. But staying at the level that we're at to compensate for the U.S. drawdown and shift in attention is going to be insufficient, because what do we have in Ukraine? A breakdown of strategic deterrence. If Putin had been effectively deterred, he would have not been invaded. Why was he not deterred? Because he couldn't have expected anything different, because since 2007, we keep on drawing red lines, he crosses the red lines, and we do nothing. Should he have expected any different now? So what are we going to do in Europe to make sure we have very clear red lines and we're able to signal a clear capability and commitment to make good on our intent to pick a fight if Putin crosses those red lines? And I think the signal from the United States is, well, we're here to help, but you have to do it. Right? It's there's this home hardware chain in the United States, Home Depot, and their slogan is, "You can do it, we can help." I think this is sort of the message from the Trump administration. You're going to have to do it. So you figure out how to do it, and we're here to help, but we're no longer going to do it for you.
But do you think that there's enough at this very moment in time, there's enough of signal and commitments within the European NATO countries with regards Putin and Russia for them not to invade Eastern Central Europe? To ask it's the question very simply, do you believe that the Russian invasion or a war between Russia and NATO in the next 2 to 4 years is more likely than not?
I worry what will happen in the interim, and you say 4 to 5 years, and I think that's exactly the timeline. Because we know with Europe's prosperity and Europe's industry, in 5 years, Europe can get to a level where it can readily deter Russia if it chooses to. The question is, what is Europe going to do in these 2 to 5 years, which is exactly the weakness that Putin perceives. Now, also keep in mind, Putin isn't getting any younger, right? And this is a leader who has signaled that his intent is to go down in history, right? The equivalencies that he draws with Peter the Great. So I think as he gets older, he knows that his timeline gets shorter. And so that means he's going to be willing to take more risk than he has in the past. So think about the asymmetries, think about his risk tolerance, and you can see that the next 2 to 5 years are going to be absolutely critical. And so we need to act decisively. We need to be able to act quickly, and we need to leave absolutely no doubt. And how we do this in the short term is going to be largely a willingness by European politicians to commit, and to commit in a unified fashion. We can't have a handful of countries saying we're all in, and other NATO member countries saying, well, sort of, maybe. Now, I think there'll be different uptakes, for instance, on the money that the European Union is putting on the table. Chances are that countries like Lithuania are going to avail themselves much more of those opportunities. But I think there's a lot of opportunity here for Europe to do a lot of things in the short term. The question is there going to be political will? And the question is also, what's going to give? And that's the hard conversation. Because, of course, this is extremely expensive. And so if so-called progressive politicians continue to sell European populations on their big social programs, and that these are fully sustainable, that sort of, you can have your cake and eat it too, that's not going to work. We're going to need to explain to European populations that there's going to be some sacrifice. And that sacrifice is likely going to have to come on the side of some of the social programs and some of the social commitments that European countries have made. And I think that's going to be a very difficult conversation. But in the short term, the immediate conversation needs to be, what is it that we can do now, and especially in the next couple of years, to make sure that there can be no doubt that the European Union and European countries in NATO are fully willing and prepared to take on a Russian army of 1.5 million soldiers by the end of 2026 that has fully recovered and recalibrated its defense industry, and whose defense spending and industry are now fully oriented towards taking on the West and towards taking on NATO. There can be no doubt, there's no ambiguity in what our intelligence service is seeing from Russia. What are we going to do in light of that immediate and looming threat?
And my last question is about the one area in the world that we haven't touched today is the Arctic. And very briefly, my question is about, since you're a scholar and expert based in Canada, how important is the Arctic dimension in all of this that we're talking today? Russia, United States, China, perhaps. There's a serious talk about this growing importance of a northern passage for especially for China ships to come to Europe. And how would you assess all of this, and where Canada stands on this, all of his chessboard, and so generally Arctic?
So it's a great question, because I think the Arctic is absolutely key on a host of fronts. If you look at the Arctic, the reason the Arctic matters from a NATO perspective is, of course, that's where Russia's border runs with NATO. It starts over in the Indo-Pacific and Alaska and stretches through the Arctic down through Eastern and Central Europe, and sort of all the way over into the Black Sea. And people, it seems like, people's thinking about the Russian border in Europe often sort of ends sort of with Finland, forgetting that there's this host of very complicated terrain, largely maritime space and in aerospace, that largely is left up to the United States and Canada to cover, and Greenland, which is one of the reasons why, of course, the Trump administration has brought Greenland into play in the geostrategic conversation. The Arctic is going to be a field of considerable, I think, contestation and challenge, right? A country such as China has an Arctic strategy and is showing up and doing all sorts of curious things in the Arctic. Russia has immense capacity in the Arctic, and geostrategically, the Arctic has always been indispensable for Russia because, of course, its intercontinental ballistic missiles, its strike capability is on the Kola Peninsula. And so, because that's the shortest way to fly to North America. So Russia has always also perceived the Arctic and the Kola Peninsula as sort of, this is any threat to that terrain from a Russian perspective is an existential question for the Russians. It's also where 75% of Russian naval assets are based for that reason. So we've always thought of the Arctic as sort of this afterthought, whereas I think we need to shift our thinking and understand that the Arctic is absolutely integral to Russian strategy. And it also reminds of I think, a mistake that we are prone to make when we think about Russia and Russian strategy. We think of Russia as sort of this declining regional power that sort of menaces Ukraine and perhaps some of the frontier NATO member countries. When in fact, Russia has a very global perspective and a global strategy, as superpowers and aspiring superpowers do. And it's able to do that with very limited resources. That's quite astounding, right? So the Russian economy, is not a whole larger than the Canadian economy. And so it shows you that when you marshal your resources and align it with your national interest and geostrategic interests, the payoff that you can get from that. And I think one of the takeaways that we can have is that our spending and our investment in defense, it's not just about how much, it's about structured spending for maximum strategic effect. What is the effect that we want to achieve? And the Arctic is certainly an area of contestation. Look, it's also no accident that when the Obama administration pivoted to the Indo-Pacific, all of a sudden NATO got interested in the Arctic. Because NATO realized that if the Americans are going to do more in the Indo-Pacific, they're probably going to be able to do less for Europe and sort of the especially near Arctic periphery. And so that means NATO is going to have to compensate on some of that. And that's a way of sort of balancing relations with the United States. And it's also a good reason why Canada remains a key ally within NATO. Because, of course, Canada has a significant northern Arctic boundaries and interests, including, of course, with Russia in the sea and the air domain. But because of those sort of interests, I think Canada to some extent can help the European Union balance out some of the US unilateralism when it comes to the Arctic. And my last point is this. We think of NATO as mainly a European defense arrangement, but NATO has these three pillars: Europe, North America, and the transatlantic space. And so we need to remember that the Arctic is very much also NATO territory. And so we need to think of NATO as not just having one front, but having three fronts: the Russian front, the southern flank, or I should say flanks rather than fronts, I guess. So the Russian flank, the southern flank along the Mediterranean, and the Arctic flank. And I think that changes the geostrategic calculus. And I think there's sort of some concern that perhaps many NATO member countries are a bit too idiosyncratic in how they think about their particular interests, rather than thinking collectively about the geostrategic challenges that the entire Euro-Atlantic community and space is facing, and how we can best protect it and assure it together via the mechanism of NATO.
Christian, thank you for coming to our podcast. I just want to remind our listeners that we have been speaking with Professor Christian Leuprecht, an expert in strategic affairs and international security. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to follow the Institute of European Right on Facebook, LinkedIn, X, and Blue Sky for more insights and updates. My name is Teodor Žukas, and I was guiding this conversation. Until next time, take care. Goodbye.